Hi, Chris. Thanks for helping my project. Could you say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Chris Hearsey. I am a trained space lawyer and aerospace executive. I work on, and I have worked on a lot of different interesting space projects over the last decade. Mostly starting with, I would say, my first project in space, which was being a space historian at the National Air and Space Museum when I was a graduate student. I spent a year there studying space history, and that sort of really grounded me in the field when I was, starting in graduate school. But I came to sort of space policy, space law through science. I was studying to be, let's say, an astrophysicist, gravitational physicist. I was technically a mathematical physicist in college. And eventually found my way to economics and ended up graduating with the mathematical economics degree instead than a mathematical physics. And I was encouraged to go down to Washington, D.C. When I was a senior at Temple University in Philadelphia. I was pushed by my former boss and mentor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I was a law librarian at Penn my last year, and I was fortunate enough to discover the stacks at Penn included tons of historical space documents, space policy documents. I think Walter McDougall, when he wrote Heavens and the Earth, actually did some research at Penn. They have a lot of historical documents, and I was kind of blown away that there had been just decades and decades and decades of discussion in space policy and law. And I always found it interesting as I moved forward in my career that most people didn't even realize what I had originally been exposed to from the beginning even exists. And so that was a big influence and gave me a really good sense of the cadence of things, right? Because space activities are interlocked with politics, unfortunately. And that's just how it's going to be. And so it was very fascinating to me to figure out, well, how the hell have people been doing this for as long as they have? And why are we at a point where I take a privatization economics course in college in my senior year, my last semester in college, and I do the final paper on the growth of the commercial space industry, which would have, so this would have been spring of 2006. So we're just 2 years after the promulgation of the Commercial Space Launch Amendments Act of 2004, which really opened up commercial space flight opportunities and sort of galvanized the industry to provide those services. And I gave the final presentation, and literally 3 minutes into the presentation, people start laughing, thinking I was the professor had put me up to a joke to the class. And no one could believe, oh, is this Star Wars, Star Trek? There's no laws in space. And professor got very angry and yelled at the class and said, this is, basically wake up, like this is the future. And it really, it was kind of an odd series of moments where it's like, all I ever knew was science. And all of a sudden I realized there's this whole ecosystem of things, and there's people realizing that this is a thing. And the more I investigated it, and studied and learned and talked to people in the industry, the more I realized, where the industry really was, and how much far along than I think most people realize, but obviously not as far as some prophets in the industry think we are. So there's always that. But from there, I was able to start my early career first at the State Department. I was a special advisor to Ken Hodgkins at the Office of Space and Advanced Technology at the U.S. State Department. From that opportunity, I further understood, the way sort of the whole system works, as I was not only a part of the U.S. delegation to the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. I also got to work on President Obama's national space policy. So I worked primarily on that, on the arms control. So I got a lot of different understandings and experiences that I think are very unique when taken collectively. It's not always that easy to get into a State Department job, but I left it to go to law school, and that's where I ended up at University of Mississippi Law School to study space law. I was recruited to go down there by John Gabritowicz, who was running the program at the time. So I spent 3 years studying basic, the regular law stuff, and then and I think it's right to say this, being a bit spoiled with the course selection in space and air law that I had, really provided an amazing foundation to the rules and understanding policy a little bit deeper as well. And from there, I was fortunate enough to get my first job at a law school at Bigelow Aerospace. In fact, I hadn't even technically graduated yet from law school, and I was able to win that job, mostly because two things. One, I had a pre-existing relationships in the industry, so that always helps. But two, I'd spent my third year of law school like studying export control and learning the licensing system. And so I was able to take that and take all my knowledge and apply it at Bigelow Aerospace. And oddly enough, again, one of those, you got to be at the right place at the right time. Basically, the first project I had going into Bigelow Aerospace wasn't what I, originally expected. What others, said, you're going to be doing all this BS work and, paperwork, and it did come. But the first project I got to do was help the company organize an argument and a strategy to approach the FAA on a question about whether or not it would permit or not permit a Bigelow habitat landing on the moon in the future. And this process at the time, I recognized exactly what they were doing, having worked in government, been part of the interagency process. I understood from an academic point of view what we were doing, but to actually do it and see that this is, we're putting the effort towards this was, I think, quite an historic moment, and led, really was a catalyst, because after us, Viasat, Moon Express, and a few others followed along with similar requests, and we were able to, start the conversation on how do we address these big issues given the current regulatory structure. And it wasn't, and it still to some extent isn't clear, although there's a lot of positive back and forth on the way that things, are supposed to be evaluated in the payload review. But the bottom line is that, we got very close to getting some strong policy changes, although it never manifested, mostly because we ended up switching focus to this Asteroids Act. And that was another big accomplishment that I was very proud of, is working on the Asteroids Act and working on that entire bill and providing inputs to the Congress, and working with industry, working with our partners and the trade union to get the first, really, I think the first of its kind law on the books that permits U.S. citizens to obtain space resources. Like that's, I mean, it may seem like a big deal, but it's such a small step at the same time, right? In the grand scheme of things, but it's the necessary step. And luckily it didn't rock the boat too much. And now, we can think, I think, more clearly in terms of progress in space. So after Bigelow Aerospace, one other thing, my other big accomplishment at Bigelow Space was the launching of the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module, which was probably one of the highlights of my life, especially since it was the first time I ever got to watch a launch at the Cape. And again, as a being there at the right place, at the right time, the beam launched on the SpaceX flight that was the first successful drone ship landing. So, just being around all these firsts around the community, it's really cool to see how everything lined up very well. Space, you have the old cliche, space is hard. Well, space is only hard because you got to repeat yourself. You can't have it perfect 100% of the time. And so, when we have to deal with people's lives or people's property, I think underinflate or overinflate, what that can mean, depending on the context. But the launch vehicle was always good. This is sort of like they moved the next step. We moved the next step on one flight, and the Bigelow expandable activity module, which we called the beam, is still on the International Space Station, still being used by NASA, and represents the first commercial habitat system deployed in space as part of a living habitat system. So I was very fortunate, and then a week, I think, later after the flight, I found out that I was taking over and for Mike Gold at the DC office, and was running the company out here in Washington, DC. I did that for a couple more years, and then I ended up running for Congress unsuccessfully and starting my own business, where I work with nonprofits and startups, mostly in space, or in some cases just some high technology areas. But one couple of opportunities have recently, I'd say recently, meaning the last couple of years, brought me to sort of a different crossroads in space, which is something that I was very familiar at Bigelow Aerospace. And that is, well, okay, so we're going to launch habitats. What are you going to do inside of it? And in those conversations, quite often, entertainment and media would come up. And I remember one time I was surprised to discover, this must have been around like 2013, 2014. Kanye West wanted to go, and what shocked me was he specifically said he was thinking about going into Bigelow habitat for his honeymoon with his wife Kim Kardashian. I just like, okay, well, the thing, what didn't shock me wasn't that it was Kanye saying this. What really didn't shock me was okay, people are thinking about this. Okay, yeah, he's got a lot of money, but this is the point when anybody can start thinking about, they have access to these things, whether it's, let's say, their own ground station or their own satellites or their own space stations, that changes the perception of what is possible. And I'm sure, as the economy, moves at its own pace and is dependent on so many different things to be there. But in the last 20 years, all of those critical, let's say, joints in the whole industry are sort of being filled in by a lot of different players. And there's a lot, I wouldn't say a lot less scrutiny, but there's a lot less concern of whether or not this is going to work, right? Like, I remember 20 years ago, if you said, oh, well, commercial launches and you're going to do it this way and that way, like everyone either was completely on one side of the camp or was wishful thinking that somehow, we're going to get down to like $5,000 a kilo to launch. And we're going to do it in the next 5 years. And, and those people are necessary to demonstrate that this is a thing, but timelines being off doesn't mean that the technology isn't in the pipeline. And when you look around the industry, there's so many stealth companies. There's so many other things that are going to be manifesting over the next 10 to 15 years, which is going to completely change the economic outlook and also, I think, the opportunities for people to engage in space activities in some way. So along those lines, I was fortunate enough to get hired by a company called Space Hero, which is working. It's a global media company. What Space Hero intends to do is to develop, for lack of a better term, a reality TV show. It's a competition series, a global casting show that will send the finalists to the International Space Station for a 10-day private astronaut mission on the International Space Station. We are, I would say, months away from kicking off some initial programming. And by next year, we should have our application open and on track towards getting the show together. So very, very excited about that. And that's certainly very different for me. I grew up in Los Angeles. So when I left LA, I consciously turned my back on Hollywood and entertainment industry. On one hand, I had a lot of family that worked in the industry. I would say a lot of family. I had some family that worked in the industry. I had a lot of friends that worked in the industry, crew, cinematographers. It's funny. I'm a big hockey fan. I grew up playing hockey. So it's just like every time I would go to the Isoplex and like, I think like Brockheimer was there. I used to see Cuba Gooding Jr. at like Pickwick and other places, or Panorama Ice Rink. So it's just funny. It's like, like entertainment and Canadians, like all of a sudden in LA, that's where all the hockey players are. So, but I didn't want to get into that type of career. Like I wanted to be a scientist. So to sort of come full circle now that I'm in my 40s, is I don't know if that's ironic, but it wasn't what I was intending to do. But I love working with startups. It's really cool to see, especially if someone has a really great idea and they're struggling to figure out how to commercialize it. It's something that I've been fortunate enough to work with some companies that are doing some really, really cool things in space. And the way I see things manifesting, I think we have an opportunity over the next 10 years really to see just some major growth, and not only growth, but changes in perception. And perception that I hope will penetrate to some extent the wider public in understanding the importance of space activities, the things that we're doing in space and on the ground to enable space, have a lot of positive feedback into our greater economy. They changed the way that we think about how to live. I mean, people talk about sustainability on Earth, where we got to recycle. I mean, like, for some reason, it never permeates. Like you literally have to do all of this in space. Like you have to find ways to economize, and a lot of those ideas, carbon scrubbing, all that are going to be important for future sustainability on Earth. But plant growth, how to economize volume so that you can have more efficient plant growth. That's going to become a thing. And I think to some extent, space really is an enabler of miniaturization and innovation in a way that I don't think can be forced if you terrestrially develop these on Earth. I think there's something about that. I mean, it's not just the microgravity environment, but just thinking about the types of problems. Because if you have no concept of zero G or microgravity, then you're not, from a physical point of view, going to understand how these materials are going to work. And as we know, microgravity presents unique opportunities to do interesting things with different types of materials, both organic and inorganic. So I think we're moving in a good direction. And why don't I stop there, and then you can ask me some more questions.
As you were talking, I started queuing up a list of things I wanted to ask and follow up on, and the list kept shifting. Well, what to ask first, and one of the things about this project was that I'm doing here with Countdown to the Moon is to go and try to get people's ideas on how they see the future of space, what's their awareness of, something that I think is going to be a very significant event in terms of kind of like a landmark of actually putting boots back on the surface of the moon. I think that will kind of, you'll have before and after that event. That's like the first steps on this new journey of continuous, prolonged, sustainable exploration. And you said something about space zero and about how do you permeate public perception.
Yeah.
And out of most of the people that I've talked to on like airplane trips at the airport, at Starbucks, I would say about 80% of them had no clue we were planning to send people back to the moon in 2024. Yeah. And, things have changed a lot since 1969. We don't have 3 broadcast television stations. We don't have the one city newspaper. Everybody gets to live in their own personalized information bubble.
We have doubled the population.
We've doubled the population, and we've fragmented the population to a much greater degree. So what are your thoughts of, just the way people are consuming information, interacting with each other, and how that tends to form these very isolated groups that are very focused on whatever it is they're focused on, and not really having like a common substrate of information that people are working with?
I think that's a product of the times we're in. I don't know if that's, because I think about this a lot, because I remember I got my first computer. It was an Apple computer. My mom got a computer in 1996. And that was the first time I'd gotten on the internet, AOL, in 1996. Date myself a little bit. But that, and I remember, going in the 90s and then going into college in the 2000s and seeing, the evolution of the internet. The most shocking thing that I didn't realize how disconnected I was from, let's say, the modern internet was when I was running for Congress. I had a staff member who was, I think, 21, 22, and I had asked them about some things I had heard, like just things that, like, I mean, I really did not realize, like, from grad school through law school, and then only into like professional life am I hearing all these other like buzzwords, internet buzzwords. And he was explaining to me, like, one example was explaining to me the different, like what's the history of like 4chan and all this stuff. And it's so funny because I remember in the 90s, it's just like everything that everyone had said, all the warnings, like completely, like people don't even realize that they exist anymore. Some of the initial motivations to develop communities online, like plur, peace, love, unity, respect kind of stuff, with you have raver groups. And so it's funny to me to look back, because it was like all of the early stuff were just the early adopters. It was the people that got it at the beginning. And so they really used those listservs. I remember using early dating sites when I was younger. You look at them now and they're just ridiculously sophisticated and kind of nonsensical. But I think, we've spent the last 30 years as a species figuring out what we could do with the internet. And then somewhere in the mid 2000s or the early 2000s, people realized that we didn't have the programming language, right, to do a lot of these things. Then all of a sudden, over the last 5-10, around 2010, you had such a development of different software applications, and it's completely changed, as you said, the way that people consume information. But the biggest thing for me that I'm realizing, especially over the last 10 years, we can talk about these different algorithms that these companies create to sort through their data and to suggest things to people. But the real thing is that because we have at least half the population living in a virtual reality, at least half of the time, if not all of the time, and then you probably have another half of the population that barely gives any notice to that. Well, the two things that are obvious to me is, one is that the people online that live those lives, it is becoming so fractionated in the things that you can combine together. I mean, like, you could literally make up anything in your mind, type it into Google, and there's likely a video on it already. Because it's just natural. Like, there's certain logical things we would all, if we just sat down and thought about it, we would combine, like maple syrup and dogs. I bet if we found maple syrup and dogs, it's a dog eats maple syrup, or
oh my gosh,
with maple syrup, or like the you can think of the infinite possibilities, right? So really, at the end of the day, it's that now that we've efficiently figured out how to allocate money back to people through these platforms. I think that's the biggest key. That why do I need to work a 9-to-5 job in an office anymore if I could make the same amount developing content, and the transaction cost to do it is basically zero. I just need a laptop and myself, and just think about what I can put on the internet. I mean, like, I will say the one thing that's fascinated me is some of the other cultures, even within the United States, that have now shown up on YouTube. So, for example, the hobo culture, people who ride the rails. There's a whole, like, I only discovered this in the last like 9 months, but there's a guy named Shoestring, for example. He's a fascinating guy, but you think about it from just any point of view, like, holy crap, this guy is filming himself. Everyone knows who he is. He's now gained a celebrity status where he's running to people who know him because he's on YouTube, but he literally shows every moment of how to be a hobo, the culture of being a hobo. He recently did a series of videos where they have I guess they have a hobo convention every year in Iowa in like July, and while this guy was nominated to be the king hobo, his friend won it. But then his friend like did this whole speech. So it's like you're meeting this whole culture of people, right? And people, you know, when people talk about like branding and marketing, okay, so what is your product, right? But then if you have a niche of a niche of a niche, you know, what is your market power? But that's the thing. Like what's the differentiator? Is there something interesting? Is it a social group that's relative to others a minority? In a minority in the sense that like we're a minority because we all think about it in the same way and other people don't. And so, you know, space is sort of that thing over there for a lot of people. So that's why being with Space Hero is a very interesting thing, because, you know, part of our business is to democratize access to space, and doing it through media. So, you know, we've been working with content creators and things like that to you know, figure out how we can push through some of these barriers to get into popular culture, which, you know, in most media things, it's more like it's just turn up the volume. And you know, I guess it's some sense, you know, it's always about the scaling. I mean, Space Hero being the size that it is, and having the worldwide reach that it does, you know, that we can turn up the volume very loudly. I think, you know, the question will always be, you know, what's the hook? But I think, you know, on one hand, it's understanding that, like, you literally, like, any person right now could go get training if they paid for it, right? And and it's not like there's just one opportunity. It's not like you just go to SpaceX to do a free flyer. And there's going to be so many other opportunities, not only go to the station, but suborbital. So the whole, if you think about it, like, we're almost spoiled, right? Like compared to 20 years ago, we are so spoiled right now. We don't really know it, right? Like, yeah, Bezos is going to take a time to get his thing together. SpaceX has got this free flyers just starting. Axiom's got its missions, but it's leading those ways with entertainment, right? Like, they're bringing up Tom Cruise, for example, soon. You see what Richard Branson wants to do, and obviously he has pent-up demand for the last 15 years that he's got to get through. But I think once we get in a normal cadence, it's more of like, does it show up often? In the same way of, what is the algorithm constantly asking you to go look at that's new? So that's why it blows me away. It's like, how the hell me, like, everything in my algorithm should be like space or like kids shows, because my daughter uses my account. Why am I getting recommended hobo videos? Right? Like, what is it about? And to a large extent, I think it's mostly random, or just sort of spurious variables being correlated because, you know, I'm a male and maybe I saw a train video one time, so obviously I need to know more about the hobo culture. Alexa, mute. Sorry. But that seems to be the pattern, right? That you have different groups pop up into society that have something interesting or maybe unknown that people want to know about it. But obviously the cadence of growth around that interest is going to be a function not only of the virality of the content, but, you know, the person who's presenting the information, the media in which you're presenting that information. And when you have viral moments, then it doesn't matter anymore, because then people gravitate and latch onto something, and it becomes its own sort of gravity well, right? Like, everyone starts to look at it and wants to know more about it. And I think that's sort of the future of a lot of this. And the secondary effects as well have been quite fascinating. I mean, I don't know how often, you know, you go on. I use YouTube a lot for mostly for research and just trying to figure out what people are doing, because I run a nonprofit, space law nonprofit called the Space Court Foundation, which you can see the logo on the back. So I'm always looking for, like, who's doing space stuff, and, you know, whether they're doing space policy stuff or space history stuff or sex in space or something interesting in space. But as you can imagine, when it comes to space, knowing that not many people realize it, there is an amazing amount of content that has not been made, right? Like, people make the things that we know, like parodies of movies, characters from space. But the thing about space overall, which I'm sort of realizing is, at least as a medium for content, is that it touches everything, because space is all about importing everything that we are into a completely different location. And when we move ourselves in the location, our expectations and assumptions have to change, because we're not on the same gravity well. We may not have atmosphere. We may have to be dependent upon others to survive, which is completely antithetical to what's going on in the United States right now. But and certainly the conversations of sustainability and renewability and surviving extreme environments and health and psychological well-being, because I was thinking early on when everything got shut down with COVID, I'm like, this is the perfect analog for space. Could we survive as a species? And yep, at least 30% of the population would go right out that airlock and kill themselves just because they cannot stand being indoors. That says a lot about not only our species, but what could portend in the future, right? And so I think the way people react to space also is important. But at the same time, we need better ambassadors. It's not that I want to criticize any of the ambassadors we currently have, but I think there is a growing problem. When Elon is the only one that seems to be representative to the general public about space, I think that's a problem. That's great, because it's nice to have someone, and again, like it, people may be surprised. Not that I would say I'm an acolyte of Elon, but like my personal feeling on all of this space activities is we got to get the fuck off the planet. So, in that vein, I think, I share Elon's motivation that, Stokowski was right. Like, this is our cradle, and at some point we got to get out of our cradle. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge moving forward for our species and for the industry, is to convince people it's worth their time. Now, the odd thing is that every time we get a bad climate change report, I feel the motivation is more and more real to get off this planet. And it's funny because, people, and I don't know what kind of political persuasion you are, but like going to Ole Miss, I was with a lot of libertarians and conservatives, and I'm probably more libertarian than conservative, but yeah, I'm not really conservative. But the point being is like you got to follow rules if you want to go into space, period. And that obviously creates lots of challenges of people's perceptions about what they think is permissible, and having to depend on others within even a small community is something that is innate in us, but for some reason that we reject on Earth from time to time. And so I have to wonder if that's also eventually going to change people's perceptions. I saw what Miss Funk said when she went on the Bezos flight, and she said she wanted to get higher, like she wanted to get up further and further. And I think that's going to be a motivation. I don't think we're going to capture everyone's attention. We're not going to capture everyone's imagination, but doing new things and innovative things galvanizes attention in and of itself. And I think the interesting thing is whether or not there's going to be too much too quickly. And that's the one thing I wonder, that people will get fatigued, because that could incentivize people trying to do more extreme things. And the last thing I want to do is see people try to do stupid TikTok talent challenges that will kill them because they saw something, in space. Like I saw this one stupid new one that it was like the milk crate challenge, where people just literally stack milk crates and then they try to walk up with them without it toppling over. I'm like, that's a great way to break your back and neck. But it's like, that's the other part of it, is just like, what else could you do? Because it's not like, it's not like you're gonna have the drink hydrazine challenge, it's like, something like that. But it'll have to be something we're not thinking about. Obviously young people will have a better sense of how they communicate with each other. And again, that's something that I'm still learning, is how young people communicate. And it's not just the language, but more of the expectations. And it's so funny because I had this thought, oh my God, no wonder I couldn't understand the 50s, 60s, and 70s growing up. In the same way that I can't understand, what's happening in this decade, because I didn't live that world and the world that I did live in, you kind of get cemented in certain assumptions, certain thoughts, and then you just have to spend the rest of your life figuring out whether or not that any of those were true. But I don't know where it will go when it comes to media and who will gravitate towards it, but I think the expectation and certainly the expectation within Space Hero is we don't need to go get 1 million people in America, right? Like if we get 500,000 in this country and 500,000 in this country, we're doing better overall as a community, as a species. And I'm not talking about the show. I'm just talking about just galvanizing interest and support. And I think, to some extent, like one, we have to push through this, you don't have access to space, right? And people aren't going to realize why, like Tim Bass and Sarah Brightman and others didn't go through with their space adventures thing. Like a lot of it has nothing to do with your capabilities, is everything to do with them as individuals. And but as you can see that people just see the surface of it and think, oh well, shit, if the average person, like who's a music singer, okay, well if a music singer can't go to space, well, but that's the thing, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because it's not only your physical abilities but your mental abilities, but that applies to anything that you put I mean, if you want to do rock climbing, if you have fear of falling, like you're probably not going to do well. And if you can't come over your fear of falling, you're never going to really be let's say you're never going to do a free solo, right? Like, so there's some things that can be controlled and some things can be demonstrated through putting people through these types of scenarios, which is why, as part of the show, there will be challenges and obstacles that the participants will have to go through as a way to show their acuity and acumen. And I think the bottom line is that at the end of the day, we could have a finalist who is the first in their country ever to go to space, and that alone, right, creates a value. And so it's those types of things that I think that I'm certainly thinking about. Certainly, Space Hero is thinking about is what are those viral moments that are already there and baked in that we can leverage and galvanize people's attention and let them know what's going on, right? I mean, it's not just like, oh, it's not Big Brother. It's you got to learn something too. I mean, this is something that's really, I think, important. I think, is a way for us to present ourselves as a show, that this is such a unique opportunity. This is such an amalgamation of all of the risks taking that others have paved the way, right, to get here. All the people that have died, everyone that's worked on all these programs, because we're getting to a point where it should be safe enough that we can have regular travel. And certainly, Elon has, and none of these businesses have any incentive to kill their customers. So, it's funny when you think about what some of the early arguments were. It's like, oh, you can't do this because you just kill everybody. Well, that's not true. First of all, like, these space companies don't run themselves like NASA, and second, they don't have the space shuttle. So, we've learned a lot, right? I mean, and that's the sum total that we need to distribute now, because, like I said, I started from history. We're likely going to repeat a lot of failures. We're likely going to have a lot of firsts, and we have to understand that moving forward. Because, to be quite honest, I don't see the point of having the rest of society keep ourselves on the planet. I don't get the point of that. Why do we all have to be miserable together? Why can't we be miserable in multiple places together? So, but I mean, we have a lot of challenges, but fundamentally, when we start thinking about how far we can get, right, initially, and I'll say, like, I don't think that, yes, I know about the 24 Artemis mission, I think it's great. I don't think we're going to do it in 24. And certainly if NASA's IG report on the spacesuits is an indication, there's just no way that that's a realistic date. But at the same time, I was aware that NASA released a commercial recently for Artemis that had Drew Barrymore narrate. So
I haven't seen this.
Yeah, I think it just came out yesterday. And it's like a 4-minute inspirational thing and talking about how we're going back to the moon. But it is definitely addressed to the public, like, hey, did you know we're going back to the moon? And Drew Barrymore, everyone knows Drew Barrymore. So I think the other thing is if you think about it, going back to that Kanye point, like more and more celebrities have an interest in this stuff, and I think more and more, for good or ill, they can galvanize public perception, and if they can do it, and if they can be a part of it, then it sort of changes. Because sure as shit, as soon as Tom Cruise comes back alive and he starts telling all his actor buddies the experience, like, yeah, it was hard, but I got to shoot a movie in space, and he's the guy that gets to walk around now saying, I'm the first guy to shoot a movie in space. You're telling me someone's ego is not going to get lit and be like, well, I got to do the same thing now, right? I don't know if they'll pull it off, but I think we'll get a lot of interest. And I think, there's certainly going to be wacky ass ideas that are probably never going to happen. But you look at what they tried to do on the station, a couple of weeks ago, by doing the space station Olympics, the microgravity Olympics and things like that. Like, who knows what we're going to come up with, right? I mean, obviously we're boxed in by physics, and to some extent policy and law, but there's so many things, there's so many firsts we have not done in space, right? And that's what people in later companies are going to be searching for. And this goes back about the algorithm, right? Like, who's going to be the first person to do a video that's just some random amalgamation of ideas? And in fact, oh God, what's his name? Is it Tim Sky? There's another YouTuber, and he's like a genius. Like, this guy's got like 100,000 like IQ or something like that. And he's had a lot of different shows in British television, but he has a YouTube channel, and he'll do random shit videos. And one of the things that he does is he tries to run algorithms to do random things, and then he tries to do them, like go find things, or maybe he puts a geography in or something like that. But one of the things that he's done is, again, like, look at you just put in a whole bunch of data, and then eventually it kicks it out. But every time you put the nonsense out there, at least what's nonsense, and that's sort of like the filtering mechanism. But that's the thing, is that then you just add more data on top of everything. So how do you sort through all the space stuff? Or that's where I really am kind of shocked that when I go through YouTube and I look at who is doing stuff space related on YouTube, it's still very nascent. You have a couple of people talking about space weather. Maybe you have someone talking about updates on space flights. The space law is pretty much like non-existent. Space policy is generally non-existent. And that kind of shocks me that maybe space is just, the people in space are just so focused on what they're doing, they don't see these other opportunities. And so that's something that I've personally been trying to leverage for the last 2 years with my nonprofit, and partner and find out who's doing what. Because okay, fine, you want to have your TikTok channel where you talk about Star Wars and Star Trek, and how that applies to law or space policy or something that we can ground ourselves here on Earth. But to get people to understand what the hell's going on, that's the problem with space overall, is it requires you to want to learn about something that is not a normal thing, right? Like, and I have to wonder if there's some sort of analogy with the way that people have perception about aviation. Like, there's some parallel here. Like, not everyone becomes a pilot, and then once people realize they could become a pilot and they look at how much you get paid, they don't want to become a pilot unless they really, really want to fly planes. So there's incentives that I think are in cross purposes that could really help with galvanizing the industry to the public. Maybe disincentives is a more appropriate word, but I do find it odd that there are not more like space channels. And then the ones that are like, they've got several thousand or maybe tens of thousands of subscribers, and all they really do is just summarize what they've read, because Eric Berger wrote something, or they read something on the press release, and they go out and they just create content out of other people's work, right? I mean, it's a regurgitation, but what do you do? Because a lot of the stuff that my nonprofit has done initially was for policymakers. Like, the average person isn't going to look at that. So that's why we've been switching to some other educational approaches. So we have Stellar Decisis, which is an animated series, moot court series. We just released the pilot on July 20th, and we invited real space lawyers and space experts to argue and adjudicate the case that we wrote. And the topic is on planetary defense. That's, everyone's probably seen like Armageddon and Deep Impact and all those types of movies. And then we have another show which we're calling the Space Bar Show. We just released the pilot in May, and we're building out more episodes now. But that's more of a variety show where we bring in, mostly information that'll probably go over the head of the average person, but anyone in the community, it should hit them really hard. And we're trying to find ways to get people's attention and doing these in these different ways. But I think that's the best you can do until someone comes up with a bigger speaker and they can turn up the volume. Everything is sort of just proceeding organically, and it's just going to take a lot of time for people to get interest. And that's the other thing, is that it's also really hard for people to get into space if they're doing other things too, if they don't dedicate it, because of the way the algorithm. I have a friend who's a YouTuber, and he tries to do space videos because he's a trained geologist, and he studied lunar and Martian geology, and he's trying to do some space videos, and he always tells me they underperform relative to his other videos, because his other videos are mostly language related. He has this channel called Polymathy, and he does things in Greek and Latin and in other languages, like, review whether or not certain shows are pronouncing things correctly in the original language and the actors are doing that kind of thing. So like the algorithm right there also disincentivizes. So like, I have to wonder, like, what is the magic formula for space when it comes to social media? I don't think anyone's figured it out. And if no one's really figured it out, and everyone's just focused on Elon, I mean, that Tesla reveal that he had a week ago with the robot was like the worst thing I think I've ever seen him do. But that's the thing. Everyone's still trying to figure it out. So I think that's the opportunity. And with it, who knows what that will bring.
Well, Chris, I really enjoyed learning about all these things, and I definitely want to include links to the 2 series that you're just talking about. I think there's lots of people that would, I guess, be amazed to find that there is space law. I've talked to people who were amazed to find there is space medicine, and that seems more obvious. Unfortunately, I have to go, but I really appreciate your time. And is there like anything in closing you'd like to say?
No, well, I mean, good luck on this project, and I'm very curious to see, what you do with all this and who else you've spoken to. So, best of luck there. And if there's anything that I could do to support you, just let me know.
I'm glad you asked. I have over 1,200 more days to go, and I could use more people to participate.
Okay. All right. So you want more interviewees?
More interviewees, yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll see what I can do.
And they don't even have to like space. In fact, it might be more interesting to talk to people who are skeptical or negative even.
Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, no, I think so. How many have you, in the short minutes we have left, how many people have you interviewed so far?
Over 600.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Yeah, I started the project in 2019, and I haven't missed a day since.
Oh, wow. Excellent. Well, that's amazing. And yeah, always feel free to follow up with me, and then I'll think about who else might be a good candidate. I mean, yeah, I bet I could find some people that you can interview that are not space people that might be able to do it. Let me give a thought about that. But
well, thank you so much, Chris, and you have a good rest of your day.
All right, you too. All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.